If fruitfulness is a result of our abiding relationship with Him, then separation from God leads to unfruitfulness or leads to bad fruit of some sort. And this never-ending quest of the human race to be like God apart from God can only mean that we bear bad fruit. And yet we're still constantly trying to measure up to all kinds of standards, including moral standards. Now, again, in my first message, I addressed at this point pretty much the concept of righteousness. That when we talk about righteousness, we are talking about being accepted in the eyes of God. And in God's case, because He is perfect and because heaven is perfect, the standard is perfection. So if I want to be considered righteous or I want to be considered acceptable in the eyes of heaven, that means that I have to be morally perfect. I have to be ceremonially perfect, religiously perfect. Whatever the standard is, I have to meet that standard perfectly if that is my means of being accepted. And we said how that we just can't do that. That's impossible for us. I call this type of righteousness kingdom righteousness, meaning it is in relationship to God and to His kingdom. But we also have an issue of social righteousness that relates to us and our surrounding culture, finding acceptance in the eyes of our peers and the culture around us. And we want to put that in the back of our minds because we're going to come back to it. And it plays a really significant role in our process of being transformed by grace. In my first message, I also introduced the concept of law. And law has multiple facets, but when Paul talks about living by law in the New Testament, he's referring to an attempt to gain God's favor by living up to standards of moral and religious perfection. When Paul talks about living by law in the New Testament, what he is referring to is an attempt to find righteousness or to gain God's favor by living up to various standards of moral or religious perfection. And doing so, because we cannot meet that standard, doing so, even trying, creates a debt that we cannot possibly pay. And the harder we try, the deeper we go into debt. In this context, living by law and living by grace are spiritual opposites. When we live by law, we go in a direction that is away from God spiritually. When we live by grace, we go in a direction where we connect with God, and there is good fruit and there is transformation that takes place. How does this work? Well, living by law, for one, involves self-effort. It involves us clawing our way toward heaven in an attempt to be like God. We're trying somehow to squeeze out enough goodness that we can find acceptance with Him. In contrast, grace is the life flow that comes from heaven and transforms us from the inside out. It's not based on anything within ourselves. It's based on God's goodness, God's life flow coming and filling us and transforming us. With law, we are constantly trying to validate ourselves by measuring up to performance-based standards. The burden of perfection falls upon us. With grace, we are favored and accepted by God through faith in Jesus Christ. The burden of perfection falls upon Him. That contrast is absolutely huge. With law, we seek to form an identity by the things that we do. Who we are is the result of what we do. With grace, we are chosen and honored as sons and daughters of the King of Glory. What we do is the result of who we are. And that order means everything. It's totally different. I am either trying to do good deeds in order to gain God's acceptance, or I already have God's acceptance through faith in Christ, through the cross of Jesus Christ, and I am doing good deeds because I love God and I want to honor Him in all things. That difference in motivation really is the difference between life or death. Now, one of our huge problems is that the tendency to live by law is incredibly deceptive. Have you ever considered that the knowledge of good can be just as deadly as the knowledge of evil? I mean, what was the tree that Adam and Eve ate from? It was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And what did God say? In the day you eat from it, you will surely die. And so there are situations where the knowledge of good can be just as deadly as the knowledge of evil. That's a really challenging thought. And I would have preferred that Adam and Eve had just eaten from the tree of the knowledge of evil. It would make life a whole lot more simple, a lot less confusing. But it was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And so we need to understand that there is an aspect of goodness that is actually deadly. And what I'm talking about is that the knowledge of good becomes deadly when it becomes a means or a platform for self-validation. When I seek to do good so that I can feel good about myself, so that I can validate myself, so that I can find a sense of identity or a sense of significance or a sense of glory, then good actually becomes deadly. And so good in itself is not the problem. It's when I use it as a platform for self-validation. That's when the problem enters in.